Welcome to this video. This is part of the Divine Will Drill series on this channel, and it's about the attribute of God is immutability. And we'll discuss how, as we advance in the divine will, that we share in God's attributes. And we'll discuss particularly how this attribute is immutability manifests in our lives and in our spiritual growth. So let's begin. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So the immutability of God, it means that God does not change, does not decrease or grow. And all of our efforts, even in the divine will, cannot increase God one iota. And according to St. Paul in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 8, Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So what about living in the divine will, where we share God's divine will, and therefore our acts become also divine? Because divine acts, as we know, are united together in God's one eternal act. How does that be that God does not grow from those additional divine acts? Well, even if we live in the highest degree of the divine will, and we live completely and perfectly in the divine will, we do not add to God. And conversely, say the fall of Adam or even the fall of the angels did not decrease God as well. To understand the immutability of God, we need to understand his eternal nature and his eternal perspective. And we have to do what St. Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 16, where he said we need to put on the mind of Christ. So in the mind of Christ, you're looking at things from an eternal perspective, where there's no past and there's no future. There's only the present. And everything, all the acts that we just mentioned in the divine will, all events, they're in this eternal now, this eternal present. And all of these acts to an eternal God are continuous in their nature. So what that means is that the implication is that any act that we do in the divine will be in that one eternal act, in that eternal present. Now, as we go through our lives and we do this in successional acts, in the future, as we share in God's divine will and we create these divine acts with participation of Jesus, those divine acts, even though they're in our future, they are in the present for an eternal God, because all acts, whether they be in our future or in our past, are in the eternal now, the eternal present of God. They exist in eternity, and God has visibility to them. And the nature of these acts, as we just mentioned, are the fact that they're united together. So it's a long way of saying that any act in the divine will that we do in the future are already there. And therefore we can't increase God, because those acts are already present to him. And to look at his perspective a little further, I like to quote Pope Francis, because he often uses the quote, God is a God of surprises. And that's true because we're far removed from God. And because of the difference in our perspectives, where we view things as successive, and God has a vision of everything all at once. He has that omniscience where he knows all the acts that will be done and has visibility of them. We are often surprised, and it's part of our history. So back 2,000 years ago during the redemption, the Jews did not expect the Messiah of Jesus. They didn't expect this type of Messiah. They had their own vision of what a Messiah should be. It would be more in the lines of a king like David, but maybe a bit more powerful. So they were surprised by Jesus. And we today, I think most of us believe that we are in the end times, and we look for chastisements of our own creation. We look at things to develop based upon how we perceive them or how we think they should be. And we don't see, as St. Padre Pio said, that the apostasy is the greatest chastisement. So looking at that as an example, the fall of Adam, which we just mentioned, God knew that Adam would fall. It's not a surprise to God. And to illustrate this, there was a discussion in the Queen of Light Syndical. This is some years back, and I'm giving them a gratuitous plug here. And it was brought up regarding the fact that God doesn't have multiple plans, because his plan is based upon foreknowledge. So he knew Adam would fall. It wasn't a surprise to him. So he did not come up, it wasn't a trial run. He knew that Adam would not succeed and he would fail the test. So it was not as if God had an alternative plan. Well, Adam didn't quite make the cut, so we're going to go in plan B. No, that's not how it works. So to illustrate that, maybe use an example. So I'm going to give you an example of something that we can relate to. So there were two sisters, and they're going to the mother's house, and they both need to leave at different times. So they go along the same route they always do. The first sister, she left first, obviously, and she gets to this bridge, which is along the route they always take, and the bridge is under construction, and she has to take a detour. Okay, so that's for the first sister. Her plan A was to go along the same route she always does over the bridge. Plan B is the detour. Now, being a good sister, she calls up the second sister and says, the bridge is out along our route to Mom's house. You need to give yourself more time and leave a little earlier. So the second sister leaves, and she goes exactly as she would to the bridge, but takes that detour and goes to her mother's house. And it does take longer. Now, for the second sister, even though she took the exact same route as the first sister, the second sister, that route was plan A, to take the detour, even though it was plan B for the first sister. So the difference is that the second sister had foresight, and she knew what would happen. Therefore, she has one plan. And there's not an alternative plan, because she knew that the bridge would be out when she got there. And obviously the first sister represents us, and the second sister represents God with his foresight. So let's talk about the growth of the soul and how it relates to immutability. So Jesus, he actually grew in his human nature. It says so in the New Testament. He grew in wisdom before the Father. And let me give you a quotation about that. And this is from the Book of Heaven, Volume 13, September 14th, 1921. My daughter, each time the soul does her acts in my will, she grows more and more before me in wisdom, and goodness, and power, and beauty. In fact, as she keeps repeating her acts in my will, she takes more bites of wisdom, of goodness, and the soul grows with the food from which she feeds herself. This is why in the Holy Gospel it is written that I grew in wisdom before God and before men. As God, I could neither grow nor decrease. My growth was just in my humanity. And again, we have to remember that Jesus is one person with two natures, a divine and a human nature. So he did grow in his humanity. He was true man and true God. Or I should say, he is true man and is true God. So in this growth, and this is really a good quote because it discusses both the growth within Jesus and his humanity, and also mentions the growth of the soul. So how does that align, this growth of the soul, how does that align if we're sharing in some of the attribute of God in his immutability, where that means that he's unchangeable, and that God does not increase or decrease. So the growth of the soul, it's a spiritual growth. And we need to talk a little bit about the gift of the divine will. So I'll begin by saying that it cannot be earned, obviously, and it's also not imposed against our free will. So it requires us to be disposed, requires our assent, requires a proper intention and desire to share in God's divine will, and also to live it. And this change, this living in God's divine will, needs to be apparent in your life. It should have a significant impact upon your life. And one way to tell that you're advancing and growing spiritually is that you begin to share in this attribute of immutability. But it doesn't mean that the soul does not grow. And that's the distinction that I'm making here. So the way it's manifested is that a person will have the ability to endure sufferings to a greater extent. And temptation of the world will also dissipate greatly. There is this significant spiritual fortitude that becomes prominent. And you can also look at it as spiritual perseverance, but I prefer the word fortitude because I think it's a bit more descriptive. And you begin to come to the point where you, in the divine will, are more of an influence in the world than the world is an influence on you. And that doesn't mean that you do not share in your typical human emotions. Again, Jesus was fully human, is fully man, and fully divine. And he also experienced sorrow and he experienced joy. And we will do the same. Another indication of this growth that I'm referring to, and this sharing of the immutability of God, is that your own human will begin to lose its power over you. And that's reflected often in your desire to embrace truth and knowledge, and to disregard the stubbornness of your own human will. And I see that evidently in people who live in the divine will. They are so ready to maybe put aside a misconception that they had or error, and to embrace something that they see or is presented to them as truth. And that's a clear sign that you're advancing in the divine will. Now, I've had examples of that in this channel. This channel started off over 3 years ago now. And in the first video that we produced, the intention was to tackle a few things. And one was the idea and the misconception that if you live in a divine will, that you don't need to attend sacraments of the church. Because as Father Bucci mentioned, that you live in the sanctity of sanctities. And so there's that misconception that the sacraments were not required, especially that of confession. So I attempted to tackle that in the first video. And I received a lot of pushback. And back then, talking about almost 3.5 years now, that was fairly widespread misconception. So I did have conversations with some people who gave me pushback, and I was surprised to see people change their mind, and readily, because that's usually not the experience we have in discussing things over the internet with other people. They usually will maintain their positions regardless what you show them. And I can think of an example where someone believed, like, doesn't really matter what the topic is, someone believed it was A, and then you show them an example, clearly it's B, and here's the proof, and here's some documentation of why it's B, and they'll still say, well, I still believe it's A. But that's not true in the divine will. You'll see people readily drop their error and or misconception, and to embrace the truth. And I'd like to read a quote here too from the Book of Heaven. And this is from volume 34, May 10th, 1937. Each truth I manifest to you about my fiat is one more growth of it that you go through. It is one more bite of food that serves to strengthen you, warm you, conform you more in it. It is one more sip you drink of the immense sea of my will. It is one more divine property you acquire. So those advancing in the divine will seek his truth and knowledge like a thirsty man seeks water. Hope you enjoyed listening to this. I love speaking about the attributes of God, and we'll probably do this a little bit more. Thank you for joining, and God bless.